Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today. So today's lunchtime talk will be providing you with some highlights featured amongst our Introduction to Net Zero course as part of the Switch on Skills project. So the overarching aim of our project is to upskill, so offering self-paced courses centered around green skills and related topics. Now, a large part of this is channeled from the perspective of industry and engineering. So it's not going to be a big shock to see on the screen that we're part of the Faculty of Science and Engineering. We're specifically part of materials science and engineering with additional resource that we tap into across the university because while we have that resource, we might as well make use of it. So just an introduction. So I'm the lecturer for this course. My name is Tom Lewis. If you're feeling formal, you can call me Dr. Tom Lewis, but I'm really not that fussy, so Tom is fine. And my journey into materials science began around 15 years ago, just over. And with the discipline being quite broad, should we say, it converges with a lot of different areas of science and engineering, and I was charged with putting this course together. Before we move into the content, so a bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions, there's a Q&A box, so please feel free to use that. And what we'll do, we'll pick up the questions at the end, and hopefully I can answer for them for you. Or if I don't know the answer, then I'll go away and hopefully come back with an answer for you. So if you do need to leave before the end of the session, time permitting, what we'll do is if there are questions directed, I'll try and send the response directly to you afterwards or when you need to leave. I'm hoping this is all going to be under 1 hour of content, inclusive of Q&A. So again, I'm mindful of time, so I will move into the next section. So what is in this course altogether? So I'm not going to be able to deliver every shred of content in the full course, but I can pick out some highlights for you today. And so in brief, what is covered in the wider course? So we discuss the drivers behind net zero, including some of the legislation and background to these, the processes surrounding the greenhouse effect, and then the greenhouse gases that we're contending with. So this includes both direct and indirect gases, as well as then some examples of where they come from and what effects they're having. The next section goes on to consider energy and manufacturing. So renewable energy technologies are a big part of this, and we cover solar technology, wind turbines, nuclear, geothermal, hydroelectric, and tidal, as well as batteries for energy storage. And then circular economy goes on to discuss, should we say, holistic changes that can permeate into manufacturing and business. So this involves transitioning away from our current economic models and practices in a way that basically preserves natural resources at the same time as trying to create value along the way. And then the third and final module begins with sustainable transportation options that are, they're filtering their way into life already. And this broadly encompasses changing both the way in which we travel and the changing designs of the transport options themselves. Now, that's an example is battery electrification. Carbon capture technology is another area, often referred to as CCUS, to encompass carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's quite self-explanatory in that it's all about grabbing carbon, using it in some way, or storing it somewhere, and ideally anywhere other than the atmosphere. And then nature-based solutions is another one with a strong clue in its title. So this turns to nature for answers which can provide us with some useful, what they call ecosystem services to tackle the problems that we currently face. But it does rely on us as humanity to honor nature rather than, tearing it to pieces as we've historically been doing. So those are the headings of what feature in the overall course. But what exactly we're going to cover today? So we'll start off in a moment by introducing the whole concept of net zero and why it's of such interest. We'll delve into the greenhouse effect to outline what's happening on our planet and go into a specific greenhouse gas that's leading the charge in climate change. And then we'll move on to some of the options that we have to play with, the tools at our disposal, and finish up with a little bit more discussion on the whole world of carbon capture, and particularly then what that means for us here in the UK. So let's get into it. Net zero. So what are we really talking about when we refer to net zero? So I guess you've likely heard of the term, along with an array of others, like you can see on the screen, which some of you might think of as, well, synonymous with this. Now, while we can certainly consider that they're related to net zero, they're not identical. So it's a good idea that you have some awareness that they need to be differentiated. Now, as you can see, there's a growing number of terms like those you can see here. And the vocabulary, I'd say, is probably going to continue to expand as more and more ways of working with and handling climate change goes on. So you can ask yourself, and feel free to pop this in the Q&A box, are there any terms you've never come across before? So feel free if you want to ask about that at the end. So moving on from the abundance of terminology, the next step for us is to clear things up and paint a sharper picture of what net zero is. So naturally, there are a few different takes defining what it is. So for you as the learner, my opinion is the best fit is a UK focused one because of where we are, and that offered by ONS. So net zero means that the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions would be equal to or less than the emissions the UK removed from the environment. So if we put this all into simple terms, this is a way of balancing out the greenhouse gases that we're both giving out and then taking out of the environment. Now we emit through a significant number of processes. That is not the part that's lacking, shall we say. It's the capture part that's the bigger problem for us to solve, with carbon capture, utilization, and storage being one aspect, amongst, say, the deployment of nature-based solutions that are able to soak up some of these unwanted emissions. Now, this all means that regardless of how much we can remove or capture from the environment, the UK must then emit either the same amount or less, ideally. So once we hit that point, we've reached what we consider as that net target of zero greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the most realistic outcome is firstly reaching this equal amount of give and take. But going beyond that, there's no harm in us aiming higher to achieve a net reduction in total greenhouse gases. And what that will do is it'll help to tackle some of the legacy emissions, because some are long lasting and they don't simply disappear overnight. So what about the likes of policy pushing things along? So for the UK, we were actually pioneers with early legislation brought in, recognised as the Climate Change Act of 2008. So the policy brought the UK to the forefront of mitigating climate change in this way. And it outlined a number of steps, but the aspect that has brought about, shall we say, the biggest shift out of them all was by adopting legally binding emissions reduction targets. So as the graph shows us here, this policy sought to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 20% of that recorded in 1990, and then we have to do that by 2050. Now, the thinking behind this value is based on a 1995 report that suggested that limiting the amount or concentration, shall I say, of carbon dioxide, which is a key greenhouse gas that we'll talk a bit more about shortly. So limiting that would basically limit also the rise in global temperatures. So the thinking is that we create this big shift through enforcement ahead of time, and that incorporates these changes to cater for the impact over the longer term that we might not really see take effect immediately, because action that we take today will take time to create the desired effect. It's almost like a lagging indicator. Now, however, time stands still for no one, as they say, and this isn't the full story. So awareness and interest in climate change matters has increased dramatically from there, and there's been protests and demonstrations, which brings us nicely to the year 2019. Now, this is the year that climate change protests took place across the globe, with thousands taking part in the UK across, lots of the British cities. And there was one unified rally occurring on what some refer to as Climate Strike Day. So this happened actually all over the world, and it seemed to do a reasonable job of grabbing the attention of policymakers far and wide. Now, whilst of course that day of protest wasn't the only contributor, it seemingly piled on the pressure, and it led the UK government to emerge as the first to declare a state of climate emergency. And from a conference I attended recently, I found out that it was actually Wales who were the first, but we're all in the same team, Wales, the UK, so we can forgive them for that. So continuing anyway to stay ahead of the curve, the UK followed through with amendments to the UK Climate Change Act in 2019. So what this did is modify those all-important emissions target values, shifting the goalpost from 80% then to 100% lower than that recorded 1990 benchmark. So yes, you heard me right. That's 100% lower. So this feeds nicely then back into this definition of net zero we discussed, suggesting a net zero balance in these greenhouse gas emissions overall. So what this means basically is that whatever we emit within the boundaries of our UK borders, an equivalent amount has to be captured in order to maintain this coveted net zero status. So let's now establish the elephant in the room, which is the problematic phenomenon we refer to as climate change. This all-encompassing umbrella term mops up some of the different aspects which can include global warming, as well as some of those other effects. And this includes, say, droughts, wildfires, heat waves, flooding, weather pattern extremes, sea level rise even, and so on. It can go on. So the Earth, its temperature fluctuations, weather systems, and the similar things, according to our understanding via climate sciences, has long been a dynamic feature of our planet. So the ups and downs have been there all along. However, now it's the extent of that that's changed during a period where we'd expect relative stability. So this is exactly why we refer to this outlier of ups and downs as climate change. So the next question to then ask is, well, how is this happening? And the strong clue you're looking for is in the picture we have on screen. So you can comfortably take away that a greenhouse has something to do with it. So if we rewind things a bit and take a leap backwards in time to some defined eras that hold significance to our planet's climatic conditions, we stop at the Pleistocene, which is otherwise known as the Ice Age. So this particular spell of time represents a phase of what they call glacial formation, which shouldn't come as a big surprise given the name, where colder temperatures reigned. So survival was the name of the game for Earth's inhabitants during this period. Now, however, as we enter the Holocene, things are beginning to change. So this period began more than 11,000 years ago, and it actually continues to this day. So it's a period of glacial retreat instead of formation, so providing us with a warmer and wetter climate, and it marks quite a significant milestone in these climatic conditions. So this warmth and consistency has allowed humanity to thrive, and that's also allowed us to advance technology greatly ever since. So if we continue our walk through time, arriving at today, now we're still technically within this phase of the Holocene, but the story unfolds particularly within these last, say, 200 years, give or take. So the conditions of our climate are changing rapidly within this recent spell. Now, not as significantly as between that transition from Ice Age to Holocene, but also more so than would be expected from a natural trajectory since the Industrial Revolution. So which leads on to the next question being, how and why is the climate changing so much? So the answer to this one is the greenhouse effect. So what exactly is it? Well, it's a totally natural and, well, you'd say harmonious process that's enabled life to thrive on the planet. Now, this is through keeping some of the heat from the sun within the Earth's atmosphere and stopping it all from escaping. Now, can we pin the blame on this process for climate change? Well, yes and no. So let's paint, a clearer picture of what we mean by the greenhouse effect. So the sun emits a spectrum of thermal radiation that reaches us here on the Earth. Now, because of the type of radiation coming from the sun, which is shortwave radiation, the greenhouse gases present in our atmosphere allow this to reach the Earth relatively undisturbed. Now, this radiation reaches the Earth, is partly absorbed, and is partly reflected back out into space. The spectrum of that radiation reflected off the Earth and back towards space is then different, taking the form of infrared and sometimes referred to as terrestrial radiation. This shift then enables the gases in the atmosphere to absorb some of that heat. Now, consequently, that heat energy that doesn't escape is then trapped and is redirected within the atmosphere of the Earth. So importantly, that infrared radiation or energy is radiating all of the time, unlike the up and down diurnal cycle of temperature that's linked to the rising and setting of the sun. So without that natural effect, the Earth's landscape would actually look quite different. So to put it mildly, a bit on the chilly side, at an average of minus 18 degrees C, which is, yeah, a bit colder than current. So to put an analogy to all that, many refer to these atmospheric greenhouse gases as a duvet around our planet, so insulating it from the cold and keeping it warm enough to be comfortable throughout these fluctuating days and nights. So in the context of climate change and net zero, when we talk about the greenhouse effect, we're actually referring to the enhanced greenhouse effect. So that raises the question of, well, what's the difference? And basically, this is the increase in greenhouse effects brought on by anthropogenic emissions, which is the fancy way of just saying the action of humans. So as such, our collective actions disrupt the natural balance that would otherwise prevail. So when the topic of climate change and such is discussed, the enhanced greenhouse effect is more than likely the one being considered. So for this enhanced effect, the process shifts in terms of the balance of where the infrared radiation or heat ends up. So the solar radiation we receive from our sun may well be consistent over the long term. However, today, our planet has a higher concentration of greenhouse gases present in the atmosphere. So what this does is trap that thermal energy reflecting off the Earth's surface, but it does so to a greater extent, meaning less heat is released into space, and that heat then stays here with the planet. So which is why you've probably heard of that term global warming. So referring back to that duvet analogy, the increased presence of those gases acts like a thicker duvet that's becoming, a bit too much, becomes more uncomfortable. And then as time goes on, we keep emitting significant amounts of these greenhouse gases. This effect just becomes more pronounced. And the whole purpose of net zero is to kind of step in and bring those levels back into balance over the long term. And ideally, if we can achieve a net reduction in order to tackle some of these legacy emissions that linger on from years gone by. So question time, and a time for me to have a little sip of water in a sec. So what percentage of gases in the atmosphere make up greenhouse gases? So I'll give you a sec to have a quick think about it. Okay, answers coming. We are 2% or less. So hopefully by this stage you can appreciate I'm not simply talking a load of hot air, and I'm pretty sure that's the only pun I've got in here, so I'll stop after that. So our atmosphere is made up of roughly 78% nitrogen and then 20% oxygen. but the remaining 2% accounting for everything else. And don't assume that just because 2% is, this small number, that it's an insignificant proportion that we just, don't need to worry about. Because when we're talking about all the gas that we can fit into our atmosphere, that volume is monumental. So we can appreciate that greenhouse gases are this key offender within the realm of climate change. And technically, a gas can be considered as a greenhouse gas when it absorbs the thermal radiation that comes from the Earth. However, so the ones that get our attention are the gases that are anthropogenic, so this consequence of human activity. And therefore, these are something that we can, we have more influence over, and it's something that we can actually impact. So the likes of nitrogen and oxygen sit outside that category because they're relatively stable, so they don't meaningfully interact with that infrared radiation, so they don't really influence the process. But greenhouse gases do, and that's exactly why they're of interest. So just to note that when we're considering these gases, it's helpful for us to have an understanding of how much impact each one has relative to one another. So, and that's why there's an established set of metrics that enable us to compare them. So these are known as the GWP, the global warming potential, and the CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent. So I'll spare you the detail to be mindful of time, but if you're interested in looking at metrics and comparing some of these, those are good places to start. So we can see here the list of greenhouse gases that we can consider as having a direct impact to the climate via their emissions to the atmosphere. Now today we won't be covering all of these, so we're going to be focusing on the biggie, which is carbon dioxide or CO2. Now, and before we do, it's worth mentioning that there are also indirect greenhouse gas emissions, which are also detrimental and can readily react with other compounds. Now, these include things like carbon monoxide that you might have heard of, nitrogen oxides or NOx, and even particulate matter. So let's get into this all-important gas, carbon dioxide. Now, most of us have heard of this one, and for good reason. It's the largest contributor to climate change out of all the known greenhouse gases. Now, we've already acknowledged the fact that prior to the Industrial Revolution, the presence of these gases were in a more harmonious balance, fluctuating around the 278 parts per million or ppm recorded mark, specifically for CO2. Now there was, should we say, sufficient CO2 to retain heat in the atmosphere, but that was also kept in check by natural carbon sinks. Now these are things like our oceans, respiring trees, plants, and even the soil that we have. And these all soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's these carbon sinks that have maintained a fine balancing act for atmospheric CO2 concentration. And you can easily consider these as nature's effective carbon capture technologies because they capture, utilize it, and store it. And today, these carbon sinks are still there, but they're arguably becoming overstretched in their capacity, partly as a result of, well, the climate change effects that impact on their function. Because if they were fully capable of sorting out this, what I'll say, CO2 mess that we've created, then we wouldn't necessarily be concerning ourselves with or experiencing the effects of climate change in the first place. Of course, it is more complicated than just CO2 because it's not the only greenhouse gas, but these are things that we have to consider as important. So as we can see highlighted here in the graph, the carbon dioxide levels measured in the atmosphere are rather high compared to the previous figure. So how did things get quite so out of hand? So it was the advent of the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s that instigated fossil fuel utilization at scale. This is our coal, our oil, and our gas. And this has since continued into our modern era and has led to greenhouse gas emissions leaping, well, ahead of the Earth's capability to balance this out. So as we just acknowledged, our precious carbon sinks have difficulty in really keeping up with this demand. Now, to put it bluntly, we started to burn a lot of things when we realized it gave off the stuff that we wanted, which is energy and heat. And we've not really stopped ever since. Now, coal may well be less used in the traditional boilers. So, like you might picture of an individual in overalls shoveling coal into a boiler to power a vintage steam powered train. Although until recently, it was still used to fill gaps in grid demand for UK power generation. And overseas, it still is quite a lot. And then oil is one that probably doesn't need much background, but crude oil and all of its refined derivatives go on to produce petrol, diesel, kerosene, lubricants, fertilizers, paint resins, plastics, pharmaceuticals, on and on this list could probably go. And these are all things that we've increasingly relied on as time has passed. So then we have coal gas or town or syngas, it's sometimes known as, was more common early on. But natural gas has played a progressive role in generating power and heat since then. So especially as pipeline networks were developed for transporting it away from the oil and gas fields. Now today, it's still frequently used for our central heating, for cooking, and for energy in particular, in the likes of combined cycle gas turbines. Now, Pembroke down the road, that has the largest one in Europe, and even closer to home. So just actually over my shoulder outside the office, on the other side of the river from our Bay campus site, Bagland Bay Power Station was one of the most efficient turbines in the world, in fact. Sadly, it has been decommissioned in recent years, so that's no longer functioning. But nevertheless, so it's reasonably clear to see that the technological development, the economic prosperity, and near enough reliance on fossil fuels has brought us to the situation that we live with and we experience today. Now, a point to stress here is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen by 50% since pre-industrial levels, clocking in at the more than 426 ppm earlier this month, and it's actually risen to 428 or above that in the last few days, which is not great. But either way, this is a sizable leap, and it's that trajectory that we kind of need to stop in its tracks. So in terms of the UK, how do things sit? So the picture here, it certainly isn't a perfect one. Now, according to BEIS, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, even though we're making steady efforts and can be considered almost a proactive nation in the field of decarbonisation, carbon dioxide was still the largest emitted greenhouse gas in 2020, racking up 79% of our total emissions. And these emissions are, surprise, surprise, largely a result of fossil fuel combustion. Now, as the graph shows us, the decline in overall emissions is, of course, welcome news. But the problem is that net zero warrants us to remove the same amount that we emit. And removing it can be a challenge in and of itself. And that's why steps to avoid emissions entirely are an area that require our focus. Now, if we pick on energy supply in red, so we see this decline thanks to the steady transition in fuel mix. And this is through efforts made to reduce our reliance on coal burning power stations, which haven't been entirely absent in recent times until the final coal burning power station closed its doors on October 1st. Now, coal power was still driving a reasonable proportion of our energy supply throughout the timeline on that graph, making up, it was nearly 40% of supply in 2012 still. However, the plans to close coal plants and then the pressure that followed suit meant that alternative sources were necessary to keep the lights on, and we need something. So natural gas has partly filled that gap because combined cycle gas turbines are both more efficient, and then gas offers up more energy calorifically than the likes of coal or oil, which means that basically less CO2 emissions for the same amount of energy that we extract. Now, otherwise, renewable technologies have been making up a larger proportion of energy supply, with the bulk of that being solar and wind. And as discussed in the BBC article here, in 2010, renewables made up around 7% of UK energy. And now compared to 2024, this has actually hit 50%. So we should see, more improvement as time goes on. Now, while the graph gives us a positive looking trend overall, the total UK emissions was still a sizable 406 megatons carbon dioxide equivalent. That's right, 406 million tons in 2020 alone. Now, while stats are, yet to be official for 2023, estimates run at less than 385 megatons, which is quite a promising decrease should that value get the stamp of approval, which it should. So we touched a bit on where human activity is leading to these emissions, but why does CO2 matter in the context of climate change? So a big part of this is its atmospheric lifetime, so how long it lingers in our atmosphere. Now, predictions vary admittedly, but we're dealing with a scale of centuries, basically, which is a long time for extra heat to be persisting, and it's why we want to curb our emissions. Now, before we hop onto the next section, I'll point out that even though the UK is comparatively doing a reasonable job of decarbonising, CO2 isn't the most potent, and it isn't the most long-lived greenhouse gas that we emit. So there are, shall we say, more layers of the onion to peel amongst the greenhouse gases. It's just the one that we emit the most of. So I hinted at some of the options in the titles, talking about what's covered in the course. Now, clearly these don't cover every option at our disposal or that are in development, because but they do form, shall we say, some of the headline methods or approaches that we can play with. Now, generally, they're the ones that grab our attention because they have the potential to impact on the most intense emitters. So a question to ask yourself is, so appreciating you might not have come across all of these, but regardless, would you like to have a guess to yourselves of what of those options you think is likely to offer the most impact in the near term? So let you just think about that for a second before I pop that up on the screen. Okay, answers coming. Okay, so let's go over a little bit of background to some of these options. So, given the strong link between greenhouse gas emissions and things that draw on large amounts of energy, it shouldn't surprise you to know that renewable energy tech is at the top of the list, because energy is the foundation of what makes our modern world. So it's sensible to ensure that we have a solid basis of energy supply that can be relied on, but in a low carbon fashion. So you may have come across or heard of the recent campaign by the National Grid talking about the Great Grid Upgrade. And this is essentially the overhaul of our grid supply to incorporate renewables as the cornerstone, I guess, and connectivity upgrades that will enable electricity to be carried from the point of where it's generated and into our homes. So that, for example, getting the energy from offshore wind farms from the North Sea and then bringing it inland. So this is going to be a huge step in curbing our reliance on fossil fuels. So amongst the different technologies that we have, you've probably heard of wind or solar, unsurprisingly. Wind meaning, the wind turbines that spin away to generate electricity, and they can be onshore or offshore. And we even have different orientations to better fit in certain environments. And then solar panels, technically classified as photovoltaics or PV. So you can see these, devices peppered across the rooftops in residential streets, and all of these are likely to be first generation silicon cell technology, largely because at the moment, they're made at scale and cheaper to make. There are today third generation devices, and things are moving along really quickly in this environment with plenty of attention and investment from businesses looking to stay, you know, at the leading edge of PV. So wind and solar together, they're adding to our renewable energy capital. And this will continue to help to move things in the right direction. And then other options we have include, nuclear power, which you can argue isn't a renewable source, but it is a low carbon one. And this could really overcome a notable disadvantage of the two technologies we just mentioned. And this is the fact that wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine brightly for us. And if you're local, you can attest to that. So it makes them, intermittent sources of energy. And then nuclear can be brought in to fill that gap, delivering a continuous supply of always on power. And that addresses the intermittency issue that comes with wind or solar. Then we have hydroelectric and tidal options because they're great in the amount of power that they can generate. Hydroelectric is already a massive source of renewable energy globally. And then closer to home in Swansea Bay, we have what was called the Blue Eden Tidal Lagoon set for development. They've now renamed that the very inventive name of the Swansea project. Whatever, not for me to comment on that one. But that will be a good part is the full scale first tidal lagoon for energy generation in the world. So that should be, a shining example of the potential of this technology or of what this could be. Then we have, batteries, energy storage. These are going to be a rather important piece of the renewable energy puzzle. So the mere ability to store energy is, going to be a feature that will help to address intermittent nature of the technologies that generate that energy and can facilitate the likes of demand side response. Demand side response is an interesting topic, so I'd recommend go and have a look at that. And then to kind of round this section out, geographic dependency is going to be an important consideration amongst all of those options because where you are in the world is going to affect the sorts of weather patterns and conditions that you live with. And that in turn dictates how appropriate or effective each technology might be. Now, for example, our northern latitude here in the UK means that solar panels aren't going to yield as much power throughout the calendar year here as a country that's closer to the equator. So it's more, well, it's not surprising that it will do better elsewhere. So the wheels are quite literally in motion for this next option being sustainable transport. So the volume of vehicles among the roads and railways are at a reliance on transport in lots of forms, coupled with the vast majority of journeys powered by combustion engines and fossil fuels, means that the transport sector emissions are problematic, should we say. So a lot of work is going on to change the way that we travel. So this is both in terms of the mode of it and then the technology that powers each journey. Now we've come a long way since steam-powered cars, and the trends are toward electric in a lot of scenarios, and not simply for cars or other personal vehicles. Now, if this graph is anything to go by, the sales of battery EVs has really taken off. So if this trend continues, then it won't be too long before they overtake internal combustion engine vehicles in terms of sales. Now, I saw a recent statistic from a seminar in the summer indicating that new car sales engines new car sales in terms of sales in China crossed over the threshold of that 50% mark. So new EVs, so that includes hybrids, but it crossed over the 50% mark with the remainder in combustion engines. Now, obviously, that doesn't make the entire fleet of existing vehicles disappear overnight, but gradually we're probably going to see internal combustion engine vehicles fade to the point that they'll occupy the minority share of wheels on the road. And then we also have the incentive that any vehicle sold in the UK must be zero tailpipe emissions compliant by 2035, so 10 years away. So unless the rules change or there are some big fundamental technological developments we come across, you're not likely to find any sparkling new cars on sale that feature the combustion engine as we know it today. And then CCUS, carbon capture. This is an interesting one, and even more so given the recent-ish announcement of a sizable cash injection for the delivery of 2 hubs or clusters. So this BBC article mentions how some climate organizations argue that a cash injection should have been focused elsewhere, which, yes, there could be a case for. However, as I'll touch on in a moment, if we don't take action on carbon capture, then we'll either fail to reach net zero or we'll fall off a technological cliff by relinquishing foundation industries, which is something I wouldn't foresee happening, or at the very least, I wouldn't want happening. So on one side of this coin, the carbon capture approach can act as a stopgap for our heavy emitters. Now, a prime example being, before we realistically achieve a full transition to renewable energy, we can operate a gas turbine in addressing a supply-demand deficit in our grid. Now, instead of its exhaust towers bellowing out copious amounts of CO2 in this scenario, carbon capture technology then minimizes what reaches the atmosphere and pulls the CO2 out of those combustion gases. Now, it doesn't address the fact that we're still utilizing a fossil fuel in that case, which is why it's a stopgap option. And yeah, you could point out that ideally we shouldn't be entertaining this intermediate option at all. But is it better than without carbon capture? The answer is yes, absolutely. So then the other side of this coin is that it addresses a very real need for our foundation industries. So you may have heard that we're now in the information, digital, or silicon age, which, yeah, that might be true, but we haven't advanced past our reliance on the likes of concrete and steel. So a meaningful amount of our modern world either incorporates steel or is made using steel. Now, leaving the aptly named foundation industries firmly in place to continue serving this fundamental requirement. Now, whilst efforts are made to decarbonize these sectors, it's definitely not going to be a quick fix, and our utter reliance on these pillars of industrialization will need an interim solution. So let's expand a bit on the technology that, at its first step, actively mops up CO2 by pulling it out of the atmosphere or stops it from reaching it in the first place. So as I've just mentioned, sizable investment from the UK government has been announced, which should provide some degree of confidence toward this technology. Now, the expectations of this aren't simply the environmental implications, but that from the serious job creation and then economic opportunities that it can lead to. So the part that's not received much media attention from the recent funding confirmation is the consideration of the UK lining itself up to be a leader in carbon capture capability. Now, the idea being that we can offer this as a service to those overseas. Now, this may beg the question of, well, why would we want to do that? So the UK possesses considerable, try that again, geological assets. So the UK continental shelf estimated storage capacity should accommodate somewhere in the region of 78 billion tons of CO2. Now, there's another stat that says it's probably closer to 70 billion tons, but regardless, that's still a massive amount. And it means that we have one of Europe's largest potential storage capacities. Now, given that much of the plans at the moment are for us to store carbon by stashing it deep underground, this is considered as an opportunity to lock it away and then charge other nations for that service. Now, the intention is also to become leaders in this space, enabling us to share best practice, and then we can be considered as an obvious resource or go-to, so we can establish and strengthen relationships with those outside of us. So the IEA, International Energy Agency, their net zero by 2050 scenario outlines that 1 gigaton or billion tons of CO2 must be captured by 2030 to avoid hitting this tipping point of a 2 degrees C global temperature rise. And I won't go into the details of why, but it's quite a significant difference. And for this reason, the approach of carbon capture is viewed as one of necessity rather than one of option. So if we here in the UK can harness this, then we can potentially address some of these legacy emissions and rein in some of that which we've already emitted over the years. Now, rolling this out to scale is both a technological and economic challenge, but from the economics perspective, as carbon taxation starts to ramp up progressively over time, which it is doing, this will open the door for carbon capture, as it'll dampen profit margins less dramatically than being taxed on carbon emissions. So basically, if you're a business and you're given the opportunity or the choice of paying tax, which is going to get more and more, or you can pay for carbon capture, then it's kind of a no-brainer because you're not polluting the atmosphere and you're not paying tax on it. Okay, so this is a video made by the team that gives us a brief snapshot of carbon capture in a broad sense, and it also gives me an opportunity to have a little sip of water.
Carbon capture is one possible route to not only cleaner steel making, but also cleaner energy production. In fact, carbon capture is even being considered as a means of vacuum cleaning the broader atmosphere. Waste flue gases usually contain other gases besides carbon dioxide, such as hydrogen, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and methane. In a simple carbon capture technique, waste flue gases are intercepted before they exit to the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is separated from other gases across a filter by spraying with a carbon scrubbing chemical, such as calcium carbonate. The scrubber binds with the carbon dioxide, which is restrained to the filter while the other gases are emitted. Under the application of heat and pressure, the scrubber is separated from the carbon dioxide. The scrubber is collected and can be reused. The carbon dioxide is collected and injected deep underground to be stored in porous rock, or can be used to make chemicals such as methanol by mixing with hydrogen.
Okay, hopefully you found that video informative. And as hinted at in the video, the first thing that we deal with in the process is the extraction or capture of the carbon dioxide gas. And there are different ways of doing this. So one effective approach is that of point source capture. So what this does is take advantage of the CO2 being channeled through a space in a concentrated fashion. Now, what I mean by this is the flue stacks that you'll find that usher the exhaust gases away from an energy generation site, like a gas turbine, or from the chimney stacks that you might picture from the foundation industries. Now, this includes chemical plants, concrete production, and steel making. Now, with the gases bottlenecked into a channel, this provides a good opportunity to filter off the carbon. Because it has nowhere else to escape to, it's then rather effective at grabbing on to what's coming through. So the other option that we know of is direct air capture, or DAC, that you might have heard of. Now, this lets us filter off the ambient CO2 that's lingering in our atmosphere. So this will let us start pulling out the troublesome CO2 from the air and tackle some of these legacy emissions that have been accumulating and causing us climate problems. Now, this sounds like a great solution. And the reality is, well, it is a good solution, but there are also some challenges. Now, if we circle straight back to DAC, one of the challenges is the fact that despite the undesirable concentration of CO2 that's hanging around in our atmosphere, proportionally speaking, it's still a really low and diluted amount relative to the remainder of the gases in our atmosphere. And by low, I mean somewhere around the 0.04% of total mark, so low. And so extracting this is a more arduous task, particularly when you compare it side by side to point source capture that emits in a more controlled and concentrated space. So there are other considerations like the maturity of DAC technology, for example, but a lot of the interest and investments that you're going to hear about, I mean, from the UK government particularly, are linked to point source capture, like that near enough £22 billion outlay I mentioned earlier. So once the carbon's been captured, what's next? And this is the fork in the road scenario, where it can either go on to be utilized or it can go onwards to storage. Now, either way is going to find itself in transit to one of those two options. And the key thing about this is keeping it close to the site where it's captured, because the transport network can prove costly, so it'll simplify things. Now, in terms of the options that can meaningfully make use of CO2, not that many have really taken hold, and there are plenty of ideas to explore or fulfill still. Now, the ones that are at least a bit more common at the moment don't make use of massive amounts, and particularly compared to how much can be captured. Now, unfortunately, those options also still possess a reasonable drawback in the fact that CO2 isn't locked away for very long before it vents straight back to the atmosphere. So it doesn't really fulfill the overall purpose of carbon capture. Now, exploring other areas can lead us firstly to e-fuels or synfuels, synthetic fuels, which serve as drop-in fuels for existing combustion engines. So basically, we can use it in our current cars or whatever other vehicle. Other approaches of utilizing carbon to form, say, aggregate minerals, and they can slot into the construction sector and be used in an array of different things like concrete. And the advantage to some of those options are the fact that then the carbon is locked up in that material, which is much more aligned to the whole grand prospect of carbon capture in general. So, generally speaking, these ideas and the research toward this are likely to continue. And hopefully, we'll be reflecting back on the bounty of different things we can produce that'll provide a benefit to us while also keeping carbon sealed away from the atmosphere and for meaningful lengths of time. So when the carbon, or when the captured carbon isn't, say, ready for utilization, or it's just surplus to requirement, that's when it goes on to storage. And it'll require transportation to its end destination. So the intentions are, ideally, we're going to use pipeline networks for this. Now, the storage method of choice particularly from the UK's perspective, is to funnel it away into a reservoir of some sort. And for us, that generally means subterranean sites in the form of deep saline aquifers or otherwise spent oil and gas fields. This makes use of the existing infrastructure for extracting these reserves in the first place. Now, obviously, these are depleted of the raw material, meaning we can then fill the void with our unwanted CO2, where we can stash it deep underground for the foreseeable future. And this is where a lot of our potential UK storage capacity comes from, along with some potential in intact coal beds as well. So depleted fields are being considered as the most reliable option, as some of the UK continental shelf fields possess a naturally high CO2 content, indicating that these geological features can safely retain this gas for significant periods of time. Now, this may well be a good indicator, but in terms of true permanence of this solution, that's a difficult one to tell. The strategy is we're going to have to keep an eye on this by having what they call monitored volume areas, so that the contained carbon is being tracked over time amongst a range of other selectivity and safety measures like your non-return valves. Now, those being thought of as suitable storage sites are at 800 meters or more beneath the seabed, allowing high storage volumes because of the high pressure, and that aids in barrier security given the hefty rock formations present. And, admittedly, there are many considerations involved in this process or approach, particularly around selectivity of storage locations, but those are the highlights. Now, to add a bit more context around this, let's talk about the bigger picture of how this all fits together. Now, 22 billion or near enough is a sizable sum being mustered by the UK government, which should provide an indicator of what a costly investment this is. Now, if the approach taken was to integrate carbon capture and build discrete networks of pipelines separated by great distances between different sites, then it would make the entire activity really difficult to justify because of the sheer costs involved. Instead, it's much more effective and beneficial to create shared infrastructure for the different elements of carbon capture. This means forming a hub or cluster, bringing together various operations so that they're all within reasonable proximity to one another. And this enables the infrastructure to be shared, lessening the burden in terms of finances and logistics. And in terms of the specific monetary package being offered, this is for 2 carbon capture hubs, namely in Teesside, which has been officially announced, and then the next is going to be Merseyside, which is still pending. Now, naturally, a lot of the costs involved are going to be linked to the implementation of those hubs, but there'll be a reasonable amount required for the maintenance and upkeep of, say, the pipeline networks, and then the storage sites involved for these activities. So once again, that sum of money is hefty, and there's argument that perhaps this could have been directed into other areas instead of bolstering fossil fuel dominated industries. A part of me agrees with that, yeah, but equally, we'd be figuratively burying our heads in the sand by not putting something in place to address the realistic gap in renewable energy and the support for our foundation industries. Now, ultimately, my take on it all is that it's a necessary approach that should be taken, as long as we don't lose sight somewhere along the way that it's all supposed to be a means to an end. I like to view it as the cast on a broken arm to facilitate the longer term healing process, which is the drive to decarbonize these varying sectors, and then using carbon capture to support that change rather than viewing carbon capture as the solution.